The morning sun cast long shadows across Newark International Airport's gleaming floors as Dr. Thompson wheeled his carry-on through the automatic doors. The familiar buzz of airport activity greeted him. The whoosh of sliding doors, the quiet beeping of luggage scanners, and the steady hum of conversations in various languages. He'd done this routine countless times before. As one of the leading neurosurgeons in his field, traveling for medical conferences had become second nature to him. Today's destination was Chicago, where he'd be presenting his groundbreaking research on minimally invasive brain surgery techniques. 15 years ago, he'd left Ghana with big dreams and a scholarship to study medicine in America. Now, at 45, his accomplishments spoke volumes: over 500 successful surgeries, 3 published research papers, and a reputation for taking on cases other surgeons deemed impossible. But despite his credentials, despite the lives he'd saved, despite the respect he earned in operating rooms across the country, moments like these at airports often reminded him that some people still saw him differently. The early morning check-in area wasn't too crowded. A few business travelers in wrinkled suits tapped away on their phones, while a young family struggled with an oversized suitcase nearby. Dr. Thompson adjusted his navy blue blazer, the same one he'd worn to accept his Excellence in Neurosurgery award last month, and joined the priority check-in line. He scrolled through his presentation slides one last time on his phone. The conference organizers had given him the prime speaking slot, right after lunch when attendance would be highest. His research could change how surgeons approach certain types of brain tumors, potentially reducing recovery times by weeks. A slight smile crossed his face as he thought about the patients who could benefit. The line moved quickly, and soon he found himself at the counter. His travel status granted him access to premium check-in, a small perk earned through countless miles flown between hospitals and medical conferences. The morning light streaming through the airport's massive windows caught the silver frequent flyer tag on his briefcase, making it glint. "Good morning," he said warmly, sliding his passport across the counter. Years of working with patients had taught him the value of a genuine smile and kind word, even in the most routine interactions. The same approach that put nervous patients at ease before surgery often worked wonders with airport staff, too. He glanced at his watch. Still plenty of time before his flight. Around him, the airport was coming to life as more travelers filtered in. The coffee shop nearby had started brewing its morning batch, filling the air with an inviting aroma. A group of pilots walked past, their uniforms crisp and badges catching the light. Little did he know that this routine morning, this normal start to what should have been just another business trip, was about to become something entirely different. The next few minutes would set in motion events that would not only change his day, but would ripple through the entire airline industry, challenging long-held attitudes and forcing necessary conversations about respect, dignity, and professionalism in modern air travel. As he stood there, passport in hand, Dr. Thompson was simply focused on getting to Chicago, rehearsing key points of his presentation in his mind. He had no idea he was about to become part of a story that would make headlines and ultimately lead to meaningful change in how airlines train their staff and treat their passengers. The morning bustle at the check-in counter continued as Dr. Thompson politely explained his seating preference. "I usually prefer an aisle seat if possible," he said with the same gentle tone he used when explaining complex procedures to his patients. His voice carried the smooth blend of his Ghanaian heritage and 15 years of American life, a reflection of his journey from medical student to renowned surgeon. Behind the main counter, 2 airline staff members exchanged glances. The first one, wearing a supervisor badge that caught the fluorescent lights, leaned towards her colleague. At first, their whispers blended with the airport's background noise, the rolling of luggage wheels, distant announcements, and the soft chatter of early morning travelers. But then it started. As Dr. Thompson continued discussing his frequent flyer status, the 2 staff members began their poorly concealed mockery. One repeated his words in an exaggerated accent, while the other pressed her lips together, failing to hide her snickers. Their behavior grew bolder with each passing moment, as if they were sharing some private joke at the expense of the distinguished doctor standing before them. An elderly couple in line noticed the staff's behavior, exchanging uncomfortable looks. The husband shook his head slightly, while his wife clutched her handbag tighter, clearly disturbed by the unprofessional display. A young business traveler nearby pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the record button, uncertain whether to document what he was witnessing. Dr. Thompson's shoulders tensed slightly, the only visible sign that he'd noticed their mockery. He'd encountered such behavior before, in elevators, at restaurants, even in hospital corridors early in his career. Each time, he met it with the same dignity that had carried him through years of challenging surgeries and groundbreaking research. "I have a connecting flight to catch," he continued calmly, his focus remaining on his travel arrangements. His fingers unconsciously touched the worn edges of his passport, the same passport that contained visas from medical missions across the world, where he'd volunteered his skills to help those in need. The staff's behavior grew more obvious. One of them now barely attempted to hide her mimicry, her gestures becoming more animated. Her colleagues' suppressed laughter had evolved into barely concealed snorts. They seemed emboldened by what they perceived as their target's silence, mistaking his dignity for passive acceptance. A mother standing nearby covered her young daughter's ears, turning away from the scene with disappointment written across her face. The line of passengers had grown quieter, the usual airport ambient noise replaced by an uncomfortable tension. The unprofessional display was now impossible to ignore, creating a bubble of discomfort in the otherwise busy terminal. Dr. Thompson maintained his composure, the same steady hands that had performed delicate brain surgeries now calmly holding his boarding pass. His expression remained neutral, but his eyes held the weight of countless similar experiences. Moments when his achievements, his contributions to medicine, and his humanity seemed to disappear behind the veil of others' prejudices. The air grew thick with tension as more travelers noticed the scene unfolding. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others checked their phones, trying to avoid witnessing the discrimination happening right before their eyes. A few looked around, perhaps hoping someone in authority would step in and stop this inappropriate display. What nobody in the line knew, not Dr. Thompson, not the mocking staff members, not the uncomfortable onlookers, was that this moment was about to become a turning point. Sometimes change comes from unexpected places, and justice arrives in ways no one could predict. In just a few moments, these airline employees would learn a powerful lesson about respect, professionalism, and the consequences of their actions. Just 20 feet away from the unfolding scene, the airline's new CEO stood quietly observing the morning operations. She'd started these unannounced visits 2 weeks into her role, believing that real change starts with understanding the ground reality. Dressed in a simple business suit, she blended perfectly with the other morning travelers, her presence unknown to her own staff. Today's visit to Newark was her third surprise inspection this week. She'd spent the past hour watching baggage handlers work in the pre-dawn light, had a quiet coffee in the staff break room, and now stood watching the check-in process with keen eyes. Her notebook contained detailed observations about everything from queue management to customer interaction patterns. The CEO's attention was drawn to the check-in counter by the subtle shift in the atmosphere. Her years of experience in customer service made her particularly sensitive to these changes. The way conversations hushed, the uncomfortable shuffling of feet, the tensed shoulders of waiting passengers. Something was wrong. As she moved closer, the sound of poorly suppressed laughter reached her ears. Her expression darkened as she watched her employees' behavior unfold. Each mocking gesture they made, each exaggerated mimicry of Dr. Thompson's accent, felt like a personal blow to everything she'd been trying to build in her new role. She pulled out her phone and began quietly recording the incident. Not for social media, not for public shaming, but as evidence for the changes she knew needed to happen. Her hand trembled slightly with controlled anger as she documented the unprofessional display. In her 20-year career in aviation, She'd worked hard to break barriers as one of the few women of color in airline leadership, and this kind of behavior was exactly what she'd fought against. The CEO noticed every detail: the way Dr. Thompson maintained his dignity, the uncomfortable shifts of other passengers, the growing boldness of the staff who thought they were unobserved. She saw an elderly man in line almost step forward to say something, then hesitate, his frustration visible in his clenched jaw. Her mind was already racing with the steps she'd need to take. This wasn't just about disciplining two employees. This was a symptom of a deeper problem. She thought about the airline's training programs, their hiring practices, their company culture. Everything would need to be reviewed and revamped. A young boy in line tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking in a loud whisper why the airport ladies were being mean. The mother's hushed response and uncomfortable glance around the terminal only strengthened the CEO's resolve. This was about more than company policy. This was about basic human dignity. She watched as Dr. Thompson calmly handled his check-in, noting his remarkable composure. His professional demeanor, despite the harassment, spoke volumes about his character. In his patience, she saw reflections of her own experiences, times when she'd had to maintain professionalism in the face of prejudice. The morning sun now streamed fully through the terminal's windows, creating long shadows across the floor. In this light, the CEO could clearly see the name tags of the staff members, their badges gleaming as they continued their inappropriate behavior, completely unaware that their highest-ranking executive was witnessing every moment. She straightened her jacket, took a deep breath, and prepared to step forward. In her mind, she was already composing the memo that would go out to all employees by the end of the day. This moment would become a turning point, not just for these two employees, but for the entire airline's approach to diversity and respect in the workplace. The terminal's usual morning buzz seemed to freeze as the CEO walked purposefully toward the check-in counter. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, each step deliberate and measured. The sound drew attention from nearby passengers, who sensed something significant was about to happen. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clear and authoritative. The two staff members turned, their smiles still lingering from their previous mockery. The CEO placed her company ID on the counter, and the effect was immediate. The color drained from their faces as they recognized the executive photo and title. Their smiles vanished like ice on a hot sidewalk. "I've been standing here for the past 10 minutes," she continued, her tone level but firm. The staff members' eyes widened as they realized the full implications of her presence. One of them started to stammer an excuse, while the other seemed to be trying to shrink behind the counter. Dr. Thompson watched this unfold with quiet interest. His years in the operating room had taught him to read subtle changes in atmosphere, and right now, the shift was dramatic. Other passengers had stopped pretending to look at their phones, now openly watching the scene before them. The CEO turned to Dr. Thompson, her demeanor shifting from stern authority to genuine respect. "Sir, I am deeply sorry for what you've experienced here today. This is absolutely unacceptable." Her words carried the weight of sincerity that no corporate script could fake. "Would you be willing to speak with me privately about this incident?" A young traveler nearby whispered, "Oh snap," to his friend, capturing the sentiment of everyone watching. The two staff members stood frozen, their earlier confidence replaced by the dawning realization of just how seriously they had messed up. The CEO gestured to a nearby supervisor who had come running at the sight of her ID. "Please find someone to cover this counter immediately," she instructed. Her voice was calm, but carried an edge that made it clear this wasn't a request. The supervisor nodded quickly and grabbed his radio. Dr. Thompson agreed to the private conversation with a gracious nod. As a surgeon, he understood the importance of addressing problems at their root. The CEO picked up his carry-on herself, a small gesture that spoke volumes about her approach to leadership and respect. As they walked towards the airline's private office, whispers rippled through the terminal. Passengers who had witnessed the whole scene were already pulling out their phones, some typing rapidly on social media, others sharing the story in hushed voice calls. The morning's events were about to become much bigger than a single incident at a check-in counter. Behind them, the two staff members stood in shocked silence. Their colleague from the next counter over couldn't meet their eyes. The weight of their actions, now witnessed by the CEO herself, hung heavy in the air. Their small, cruel attempt at humor had backfired spectacularly, and the consequences were just beginning to unfold. The CEO held the office door open for Dr. Thompson, showing him the basic courtesy her employees had failed to provide. As they entered the room, she knew this conversation would be the first step in a much larger change. Sometimes it takes a moment of crisis to spark genuine transformation, and she was determined to make this moment count. In the terminal, normal activities slowly resumed, but something had shifted. The passengers who witnessed the scene shared knowing looks. They had just seen justice served in real time. A reminder that sometimes karma arrives wearing a business suit and carrying a company ID. Inside the private office, away from the bustling terminal, the atmosphere shifted to something more solemn. The CEO gestured toward a comfortable chair while she took a seat behind a simple desk. Sunlight filtered through vertical blinds, creating alternating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to underscore the gravity of the moment. "First, let me apologize again," she began, her voice carrying the weight of genuine concern. "What happened out there?" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "It's not just about poor customer service. It's about human dignity." Dr. Thompson adjusted his tie thoughtfully before speaking. "You know," he said, his voice carrying years of similar experiences, "this isn't the first time something like this has happened." He shared a story about a flight 3 months ago, where a flight attendant had repeatedly ignored his requests for water while serving other passengers in business class. The CEO leaned forward, her notebook open, pen poised. But she wasn't just taking notes. She was listening with her full attention, the kind of listening that makes someone feel truly heard. When Dr. Thompson mentioned another incident at a different airport, her pen stopped moving, and she simply listened, her expression reflecting her deep concern. "Last year," he continued, "I was rushing to perform emergency surgery in Boston. The staff at the priority check-in insisted on double-checking my medical credentials, even with my hospital ID clearly visible. We almost lost precious time." His voice remained steady, but the memory clearly still stung. The morning light had grown stronger now, warming the room as Dr. Thompson shared more experiences. He spoke about subtle dismissals, about being mistaken for support staff despite wearing surgeon scrubs, about having his frequent flyer status questioned despite his platinum card being clearly visible. The CEO's face showed understanding that went beyond professional courtesy. She pulled out her phone, showing Dr. Thompson the video she'd recorded of the incident. "This isn't just about sensitivity training," she said firmly. "This is about changing the culture from the ground up." They discussed solutions, real, practical changes that could make a difference. Dr. Thompson suggested scenarios from his experiences that could be used in training. The CEO took detailed notes, occasionally adding her own insights from 20 years in the industry. "You know what hurts the most?" Dr. Thompson said, looking out the window at a plane taking off. "It's not the big, obvious incidents. It's the small things. The tiny dismissals. The subtle ways people make you feel like you don't belong, even after all these years of hard work." The CEO nodded, understanding in her eyes. She shared a brief story of her own journey, of being underestimated and overlooked before reaching her current position. The conversation shifted from formal to genuine, two professionals finding common ground in shared experiences. "I'm not interested in just disciplining those two employees," she explained, closing her notebook. "That's necessary, but it's not enough. We need systematic change." Her words carried the conviction of someone who had been waiting for the right moment to implement major reforms. As their conversation drew to a close, Dr. Thompson checked his watch. His flight would board soon. But this delay felt worthwhile. For the first time in his years of traveling, he felt like his experiences weren't just being documented, but truly understood. The CEO stood, extending her hand. "Thank you for taking the time to share this with me," she said. "I promised you, this conversation will lead to real change." The handshake they shared was more than a formality. It was a moment of mutual respect between two professionals who understood the importance of turning difficult moments into opportunities for progress. Back in her office after the morning's events, the CEO didn't waste a single minute. Her fingers flew across her keyboard as she drafted an email that would reach every employee across the airline's global network. The wall clock ticked steadily, marking each moment of what would become a pivotal day in the company's history. The first order of business was clear. She picked up her phone and called Human Resources. "I need both employees from this morning's incident placed on immediate administrative leave," she said, her voice firm. "And I want a full investigation launched within the hour." The HR director, hearing the urgency in her voice, didn't ask for explanations. Those would come soon enough. She paused her typing to look out her office window, watching planes take off and land. Each aircraft carried hundreds of passengers, each with their own story, their own dignity that deserved respect. The morning's incident had simply highlighted what she'd suspected since taking the position. The problem went deeper than a few insensitive employees. The company-wide memo she was drafting wouldn't be the usual corporate speak. She deleted and rewrote sentences, determined to strike the right tone. "This morning," she typed, "I witnessed behavior that has no place in our airline or anywhere else." She attached the video she'd recorded, knowing that seeing was believing. Her assistant poked his head in. "The press is starting to call," he said quietly. Several passengers had posted about the incident on social media, and the story was gaining traction. The CEO nodded. She'd been expecting this. "Let them," she replied. "We have nothing to hide. This is going to be about real change, not damage control." She stood up and walked to her whiteboard, starting to map out a comprehensive action plan. First circle: immediate response, the administrative leave, investigation, and memo. Second circle: short-term changes, mandatory sensitivity training for all customer-facing staff. Third circle: long-term transformation, a complete overhaul of hiring practices, training programs, and company culture. Her phone buzzed again. The board of directors wanted an emergency meeting. Of course they did. This kind of incident could affect stock prices. She scheduled it for later that afternoon, already preparing her arguments. This wouldn't be a superficial fix with a PR campaign and a few fired employees. She was going to push for real, lasting change. Looking at the photos on her office wall, pictures of her first days as a flight attendant, her graduation from business school, her promotion to management, she remembered her own journey. Each step had taught her valuable lessons about leadership and responsibility. Today, she would put all those lessons to use. The office printer hummed as it produced copies of her new zero-tolerance policy. The document was clear and direct. Any discriminatory behavior would result in immediate termination. No warnings, no second chances. Respect for all passengers would become as fundamental as flight safety protocols. She reviewed the upcoming training program outline on her laptop. It wouldn't be the usual boring videos and multiple-choice tests. Instead, she envisioned interactive sessions, real-world scenarios, and most importantly, speakers sharing their actual experiences, starting with Dr. Thompson, if he was willing. Her assistant appeared again, this time with a stack of messages. Other airlines were calling, asking about her approach to the incident. Word was spreading fast. She smiled slightly. Maybe this could spark industry-wide change. Sometimes it takes one clear example to open everyone's eyes. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across her desk, she reviewed everything one final time. The memo was ready to send, the investigation was underway, and the framework for long-term changes was taking shape. She clicked Send on the company-wide email. knowing that by tomorrow morning, every employee would understand that a new era had begun. The next 3 months brought winds of change through every level of the airline. The training center, usually quiet by late afternoon, now buzzed with activity well into the evening. Today, a group of flight attendants sat in a redesigned classroom, listening intently to a guest speaker, a frequent flyer sharing his experiences of being profiled at airports. The CEO had kept her promise. The changes weren't just about putting up new posters about diversity or making employees watch outdated training videos. Instead, real people shared real stories. Customer service staff learned about unconscious bias through interactive workshops where they could ask honest questions without fear of judgment. In the break room, a veteran flight attendant wiped tears from her eyes after a particularly moving session. "I never realized," she told her colleagues, "how many little things we do that can hurt people without even meaning to." Her words echoed what many others were feeling: a genuine awakening to the impact of their actions. The hiring process transformed too. Interview panels now included people from diverse backgrounds. Questions focused not just on technical skills, but on how candidates would handle real-world situations involving passengers from different cultures. Old scenarios about dealing with difficult passengers were replaced with exercises in understanding and empathy. At check-in counters across the country, subtle but significant changes appeared. Staff members now wore pins showing they'd completed cultural sensitivity training. More importantly, their behavior showed they'd taken the lessons to heart. They greeted each passenger with genuine respect, took time to understand accents without showing frustration, and stepped in when they noticed any signs of discrimination. The CEO herself stayed involved, often showing up unannounced at different airports. But now, instead of catching bad behavior, she increasingly found herself witnessing positive changes. She watched as a ground staff member patiently helped an elderly passenger who spoke limited English, taking extra time to ensure they understood everything about their flight. The company's internal reporting system got an overhaul too. Employees could now easily report concerns about discrimination, and more importantly, they actually did. The old culture of looking the other way was replaced by one where speaking up was valued and protected. In the staff cafeteria, conversations changed. Instead of complaining about difficult passengers, employees shared tips on how to better serve people from different backgrounds. They discussed cultural differences with curiosity rather than judgment, and shared stories of positive interactions with passengers. One morning, a supervisor overheard two new hires discussing how to pronounce a passenger's name correctly. Instead of making fun of the unusual name, they were genuinely trying to show respect by getting it right. It was a small moment, but it showed how deeply the changes had taken root. The training program expanded to include sessions on medical professionals who travel frequently, religious accommodations, and cultural celebrations. Staff learned about dietary restrictions, holiday customs, and why some passengers might need extra time during security checks due to religious clothing. In the employee break room, a wall of thank you notes started growing. Passengers wrote about feeling respected, about staff members who went above and beyond to make them feel welcome. These weren't just corporate testimonials, they were real stories from real people who'd noticed the difference. The CEO's inbox filled with emails from other airlines asking about the training program. What started as a response to one incident was becoming a model for the entire industry. Sometimes, late at night in her office, she would read these messages and smile, knowing that the ripples of change were spreading far beyond her own airline. The formal apology letter arrived at Dr. Thompson's office on cream-colored paper with the airline's embossed logo. But it wasn't just another corporate form letter. The CEO had handwritten a personal note at the bottom, thanking him for his courage in speaking up and his willingness to help create change. Inside the envelope, along with the letter, was a lifetime premium status card. It gleamed gold in the office light, but what really caught Dr. Thompson's attention was the invitation that came with it. The airline wanted him to be a key speaker in their new cultural awareness training program. During his first presentation to the airline staff, Dr. Thompson stood at the podium, looking out at a room full of attentive faces. He wasn't there to shame anyone. Instead, he shared stories, not just about discrimination, but about the small acts of kindness he'd experienced too. He talked about flight attendants who'd helped him make tight connections when rushing to emergency surgeries and ground staff who'd gone the extra mile. "It's not about being perfect," he told the room. "It's about being better." The staff listened intently as he described how it felt to be judged based on his accent rather than his actions. In the back of the room, the CEO nodded approvingly, watching as her employees began to truly understand. During the coffee break, several staff members approached him with questions. One flight attendant shared her own story of being judged for her appearance, and how this training helped her see the connection to what others experienced. The conversations were honest, sometimes uncomfortable, but always respectful. The airline made sure Dr. Thompson's story reached every corner of their operation. His experience became a case study in their training materials, but they didn't just focus on what went wrong. They also highlighted the positive changes that came from it, how one difficult moment led to real transformation. In the employee break rooms, new posters appeared showing quotes from various passengers sharing their experiences. Dr. Thompson's words were among them. "Change happens when we choose to learn from our mistakes instead of defending them." The quote became something of a motto for the airline's customer service teams. The CEO kept him updated on the changes. She sent regular emails describing new training programs, policy updates, and positive feedback from both passengers and staff. It wasn't just about keeping him informed. It was about showing him that his experience had truly sparked lasting change. During one of his regular flights, Dr. Thompson noticed the difference. The staff didn't treat him with awkward over-politeness or forced friendliness. Instead, there was a natural respect, the kind that comes from genuine understanding rather than just following rules. At a medical conference a few months later, several colleagues mentioned noticing changes in how the airline's staff handled cultural differences. One doctor, originally from Thailand, shared how a flight attendant had correctly pronounced her name without having to be corrected, a small but meaningful change. The story spread through the medical community, and soon other professionals began sharing their own experiences of positive changes they'd noticed. What started as one incident had grown into something much larger, a real shift in how people were treated. Late one evening, as Dr. Thompson boarded a flight for another medical conference, a young ground staff member thanked him quietly. "Your story changed how we work," she said simply. "We're better at our jobs because of you." He smiled, knowing that sometimes the biggest changes start with one person willing to speak up. 1 year later, the airport buzzed with its usual energy, but something was different. At the check-in counters, staff greeted passengers with genuine warmth, their newly earned cultural awareness pins catching the morning light. The airline had just been named industry leader in customer service by a major travel magazine, with special recognition for their inclusive practices. The CEO stood in the same spot where she'd witnessed the incident a year ago. But this time, she was watching a very different scene unfold. A young staff member was patiently helping an elderly couple who spoke limited English, taking extra time to ensure they understood their connection details. Nearby, another employee was professionally handling a complex situation with a group of international travelers. In the main terminal, a large display showcased the airline's journey over the past year. Photos showed training sessions, community events, and testimonials from passengers and staff alike. One particularly touching image captured a moment from Dr. Thompson's latest training session, where he now regularly shared his story as part of the airline's enhanced customer service program. The morning news played on the terminal's TVs, featuring a story about how the airline's transformation had influenced the entire industry. Other airlines had started adopting similar training programs, and industry standards for cultural sensitivity were being rewritten. What began as one difficult moment had sparked a movement toward real change. At the staff morning briefing, The supervisor discussed the latest customer feedback scores, the highest they'd ever been. But more importantly, she shared stories from passengers who felt truly welcomed and respected. These weren't just numbers on a chart. They were real experiences from real people. Dr. Thompson still flew regularly for his medical conferences, and each time he noticed small but significant improvements. The staff didn't just avoid discrimination. They actively created an environment where every passenger felt valued. He'd overheard conversations in different languages being handled with patience and respect, seen staff members stepping in to help before problems arose, and witnessed countless small acts of kindness. In the employee break room, the wall of thank you notes had grown so large they needed a bigger board. Letters came in from around the world, written in different languages, but sharing the same message: gratitude for being treated with dignity and respect. Each note reminded the staff why their changes mattered. The airline's training program had become a model for others. Companies outside the aviation industry started reaching out, asking how they could implement similar changes. The CEO frequently spoke at business conferences, sharing how one moment of crisis had led to lasting positive change. During a busy holiday season, a reporter visiting the airport noted how smoothly everything ran despite the cultural and linguistic diversity of the passengers. The staff handled each interaction with professional ease, making everyone feel welcomed and respected. It wasn't forced or artificial. It had become their natural way of doing things. The 2 employees from the original incident had long since been let go, but their story became part of the airline's training manual, not to shame them, but to show how far the company had come. New hires learned about the incident as part of their orientation, understanding that respect and dignity were non-negotiable parts of their job. As the sun set on another busy day at the airport, the CEO walked through the terminal one last time. She watched as passengers from all walks of life moved through check-in, security, and boarding gates, each treated with the same level of respect and care. This was the legacy of that difficult morning a year ago. Not just a policy change, but a fundamental shift in how people treated each other. Dr. Thompson's words from his last training session echoed in the halls. Change isn't just about avoiding mistakes. It's about creating a world where those mistakes become unthinkable. And in this airport, at this airline, that change had taken root and flourished.